"You're not actually part of this family," my brother-in-law said, leaning back in his chair like he'd just said something reasonable. "You never have been, you just happen to live here." My sister laughed. My mother-in-law refilled her wine glass. Nobody looked at me. "My name is Veda Calloway. I'm 31 years old, I work in corporate accounting, and for the past 6 years I have been the quiet financial engine behind a family that has never once asked how I was doing. It started small, the way these things always do. My husband, we'll call him what he is now, my ex-husband, came from a family that treated money like a communal resource, not in the generous, loving way. In the way where certain people contribute and everyone else withdraws, and the system only works because one person never says no. I was that person. I didn't know it yet. I thought I was just being a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, a good member of the family I'd married into. The dinner that night was at my mother-in-law's house, the one I'd helped renovate 2 summers ago when the roof started leaking, and she said she had no idea how she'd manage. I'd written the check myself, $4,200. I remember because I had to move money from my emergency fund, and I told myself I'd replenish it by fall. I never did, 'cause something else came up. Something else always came up. My brother-in-law was sitting at the head of the table, which I'd always found strange since it wasn't his house. But he had a way of taking up space that nobody ever challenged. His name doesn't matter. What matters is what came next. I set down my fork. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. "I mean you've always been a little outside of things," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Like you're here, but you're not really one of us." "She knows what she is," my mother-in-law said, not unkindly, which was almost worse, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. My sister, my husband's sister, nodded slowly the way she did when she wanted to seem thoughtful. "You've always kind of kept yourself separate, Veda, we've noticed." I looked at my husband. He was studying the tablecloth. "Okay," I said. That was all. Just okay. I picked up my fork, finished what was on my plate, and smiled when my mother-in-law brought out the dessert she'd made from a recipe I'd sent her 3 months ago. I complimented it. I helped clear the table. I drove home with my husband in silence, and when he asked if I was fine, I said yes. I was not fine, but I was finished. Here's what they didn't know. 3 weeks before that dinner, I'd had a very quiet conversation with a financial advisor. I'd been seeing C's on my own for about 4 months. I'd started going after I realized, during a routine budget review, that my personal savings had not grown in 2 years, despite the fact that I'd received 2 raises and hadn't made any significant purchases for myself. I kept looking at the numbers, running them, and then I found it. Or rather, I found the shape of it. The pattern of small transfers, the automatic payments attached to accounts I'd set up and then sort of forgotten about, the joint credit card that I was the primary holder on, but that my brother-in-law used whenever his own card was declined, which was often. I didn't say anything. I made an appointment. I brought my documents. My advisor looked at them for a long time, and then looked at me and said, "Do you understand the liability exposure you're carrying right now?" I did not. She explained it calmly and thoroughly, the way someone explains something to a person who is not stupid but has been very, very distracted. I drove home that night feeling like the ceiling had lifted off the car. Not in a good way. In the way where suddenly you can see how far the sky actually is and how small you are underneath it. I didn't act right away. I wanted to be sure. I spent 3 weeks documenting everything, and I mean everything. Transfers, dates, amounts. The lease I'd co-signed for my brother-in-law's apartment when he'd moved out after the divorce from his first wife and had no rental history and, as it turned out, no plan. The car loan I'd guaranteed for my sister-in-law because she'd had a bankruptcy and the dealership wouldn't approve her otherwise. The medical bill I'd paid for my mother-in-law because she said she'd been denied and was embarrassed and couldn't tell my husband because it would stress him out. I paid it. I filed it under helping out. I had a whole folder in my head labeled helping out, and when I finally sat down and added it up with my advisor, the number made me put my pen down. $63,000. Over 6 years. Not counting the renovation, my husband knew about some of it, not all of it. We'd never had a real conversation about money, which I understand now was itself a kind of answer. After that dinner, I called my attorney. I didn't have an attorney before, but I got one. You'd be surprised how quickly things move when you walk into an office with organized documentation and a clear question. She reviewed everything and gave me a timeline. I followed it exactly. The first thing I did was nothing. That's the part people always underestimate. I didn't send an email. I didn't have a conversation. I didn't give any speeches. I just started separating, quietly and methodically, the way you'd untangle a knot without pulling the wrong strand. I opened accounts in my name only. I moved my direct deposit. I spoke to the lender on the car loan about my options. I contacted the leasing office about my cosign status and what it would take to remove it. Some things I could fix entirely. Some things I couldn't, which my attorney explained meant I needed to create a paper trail showing I'd attempted to remedy the situation. I created it. The automatic transfers were the easiest. I'd set them up years ago, some of them, and this is the part I'm almost embarrassed to admit, I'd actually forgotten about. $400 a month to my mother-in-law's household account for shared expenses related to the renovation. The renovation had been done for 19 months. I'd kept paying. I hadn't looked. That's the thing about being the person who handles money in a family that doesn't want to think about money. You stop thinking about it too, eventually. You just keep it moving. I stopped it. I made a list of everything I was going to change and the order I was going to change it in, and I taped that list inside my closet door where I could see it every morning. I gave myself 30 days. I used 26. My brother-in-law's card was the first thing that registered publicly. He called my husband, not me, which told me everything about how that household thought of money and whose name was actually attached to it. My husband came into the kitchen where I was making coffee, and he had a look on his face I hadn't seen before. Uncertain. A little pale. Did something happen with the card, he asked. I closed it, I said. Which card? The one your brother has been using for 3 years without paying. Silence. Veda, the billing statements are on the table, I said, if you want to look at them. He didn't pick them up. He stood there for a moment and then said, I think we need to talk about this as a family. Sure, I said. He called his mother. His mother called his sister. His sister apparently called his brother because within 2 hours I had 4 text messages from 4 different family members, each one escalating slightly in tone. The first was confused. The second was hurt. The third was frustrated. The fourth, from my brother-in-law, just said, You need to fix this today. I didn't respond to any of them. My mother-in-law showed up 2 days later. Not at the door. She let herself in with the spare key I'd given her 2 years ago when she was recovering from her knee surgery, and I wanted her to be able to check on things. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and she walked in and I looked at her and I thought, I need to change the locks. I added it to my list. Sit down, she said, though it was my house. I closed my laptop. She sat across from me and folded her hands and said, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is not how we handle things in this family. How does this family handle things? I asked. She blinked. She wasn't expecting a question. She was expecting an apology. We talk, she said. We work things out. I'd like to show you something, I said. I opened my laptop and turned it toward her. Spreadsheet. 6 years of transactions, color-coded by recipient. I'd included a running total at the bottom, updated by month. She looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. I wasn't aware of all of this, she finally said. I know, I said. That's part of the problem. She left without the apology she'd come for. That afternoon, she called my husband and cried, which I know because I heard his side of the conversation. He came to find me afterward. He sat down, and for the first time in a long time, he looked like he was actually trying to think through something complicated rather than just manage a situation. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. I did, I said. 3 times. You said you'd handle it and then you didn't, so I kept handling it. He didn't argue. That surprised me. I didn't know it was this much, he said. I know you didn't. What are you going to do? I already did it, I said. What happened next was not a fight. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to watch. My husband had to have conversations with his own family that he had never had before, about money, about expectations, about what they had all assumed would continue indefinitely, because it always had. My brother-in-law lost the apartment, not immediately, and not because of anything I did directly, but because without my co-signature, his renewal application didn't go through, and he hadn't thought to plan for that. My sister-in-law had to refinance the car, which meant confronting the credit issue she'd been avoiding for 2 years. My mother-in-law sat with a bill from a specialist she'd been deferring and had to call my husband for help, which she'd never had to do before because she'd always called me. None of this was pleasant to watch. I want to be honest about that. These were not faceless people. I had eaten at that woman's table for 6 years. I had sat with my sister-in-law in the waiting room while she had a biopsy that turned out to be nothing. I had helped my brother-in-law move twice. There was real history there. I wasn't untangling myself from villains. I was untangling myself from a pattern that had been built so gradually, so naturally, that nobody, including me, had ever looked at it straight on. But here is what I also know. At no point during any of those 6 years had anyone asked me how I was doing financially. Not once. Nobody had said, "Is this too much?" Nobody had offered to pay anything back. Nobody had even said thank you in a way that acknowledged the actual scale of what was happening. The language that had been used always was "family helps family," as if that phrase excused the fact that the help only moved in one direction. The family gathering happened about a month after the dinner. My mother-in-law called it a check-in, which I suspected immediately was not going to be a neutral event. My husband asked if I was going. I said yes. I know the question is obvious, why go, if I'd already detached, because I'd learned something from those 6 years of quiet accommodation. Staying invisible had never protected me. I decided I was done being absent from conversations about me. I drove myself. That was deliberate. The living room was full when I arrived. My mother-in-law, my brother-in-law, and his girlfriend, my sister-in-law, an aunt I'd met twice, and 2 cousins who I could tell from their posture had been briefed on the situation. My husband was already there, sitting slightly apart from everyone else, which I noted. My mother-in-law spoke first, which was also expected. "We're all concerned," she said, "about the direction things have been going. And we think it's important that we talk about how this family moves forward together." I looked around the room. Everyone was watching me with expressions ranging from prepared sympathy to barely disguised frustration. "I think that's a good idea," I said. "Can I share something first?" I had printed the spreadsheet. I also had a 1-page summary my attorney had helped me draft. Nothing threatening, just a clear factual accounting of the financial relationships that had existed, the steps I had taken to modify them, and what my ongoing obligations actually were versus what had been assumed. I placed a copy in front of each person. The room got very quiet. My brother-in-law pushed his copy away without looking at it. "This is not about money," he said. "It's mostly about money," I said. "It's about loyalty," my mother-in-law said. "I was loyal for 6 years," I said, "to the tune of $63,000. I'd love to have a conversation about what loyalty means going forward." Nobody had a response to that, not a real one. My sister-in-law started crying, which I hadn't expected and which hurt more than I thought it would, because I didn't think she was performing. I think she was genuinely sad and genuinely surprised, and I think she'd never actually added it up in her own head before. Sometimes the people in these situations aren't calculating. They're just comfortable. Comfort is its own kind of blindness. I left before the conversation found its footing. I had said what I needed to say. I didn't need a verdict. The divorce was not because of that evening, or that dinner, or any single thing. It was because of what those events revealed, which was that my husband and I had built something that looked like a partnership, but functioned like a pass-through. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He had just grown up in a system where one person's resources belonged to everyone, and he had never questioned it. And when I forced him to question it, he didn't know what he thought. Maybe that would have been different given time. I wasn't willing to spend more time finding out. We separated in March. It was civil. We used a mediator. The financial disclosures were actually easier than I expected, partly because I had 6 years of meticulous records, and partly because we didn't have as much shit as either of us had assumed. I'd been paying for things. He'd been living in the house those payments built. When it was laid out plainly, there wasn't much to fight over. He apologized once, near the end of the process. We were sitting in the mediator's office and there was a break, and he turned to me and said, "I should have paid more attention." "Yes," I said. "I didn't know it was that much. I know. Did you ever think about telling me everything? Like actually sitting down and telling me?" I thought about it. I tried. But I also think I didn't push hard enough because I was afraid of what it meant if you knew and still didn't do anything. He nodded slowly. That was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. The last time I saw my mother-in-law was in a coffee shop, about 4 months after everything was finalized. She looked smaller to me, though she hadn't changed physically. She was with a friend, and we spotted each other across the room, and there was a moment where I could see her deciding whether to wave. She did, a small one. I waved back. We didn't speak. I was there with a friend of my own, someone I'd been neglecting for about 3 years because I was always managing something. We were looking at photos from a trip we'd just taken together, a week in Portugal that I'd booked the previous December, the first real vacation I'd planned for myself in 4 years. My friend was laughing at a picture of me eating a custard tart on a cobblestone street somewhere outside Lisbon, not looking at the camera, just eating the tart, and looking out at the water with the expression of someone who had temporarily forgotten everything they were supposed to be carrying. I look at that photo sometimes. I keep it on my phone. The thing I didn't expect after all of it, the documents, the attorney, the spreadsheet, the gathering, the divorce, was how much quieter life would get. Not lonely quiet, just quiet. No one needing something at 7 a.m. No texts about emergencies that turned out to be inconveniences. No one assuming that my Friday night was automatically available because a situation had come up. I got to be bored sometimes. I hadn't been bored in years, and I hadn't realized how much I missed it. That flat open stretch of time with nothing required of you. I started cooking things I'd been wanting to cook for a long time. I read books in the middle of the afternoon on weekends. I called my own mother more, the one who was actually mine, and she said I sounded different. Better, she said. Like yourself, the financial piece sorted itself out over about 18 months. I won't pretend it was easy. There were months where the legal fees hit harder than expected and I had to be careful. But I was good at being careful, it turned out. I just hadn't been directing that skill at myself. What I know now on the other side is this: I was not difficult. I was not cold. I was not the villain in the story that family told themselves about why things fell apart. I was the person who had been quietly funding a life that was never entirely my own, and when I stopped, the life stopped, and then they needed someone to blame for the stopping. What I was expensive. Not in the way they meant when they dismissed me. In the literal, actual, documented sense. They had been spending me, my income, my credit, my name, my Friday nights, my emergency fund, my Portugal trip that took 4 years to happen, without ever once asking the price. I'm not angry about it anymore. Anger was the first thing, but it didn't last long because it was heavy, and I'd already been carrying heavy things for too long. What I am now is specific. I know exactly what I'm willing to do, for whom and why. I have a budget that I look at once a month and that nobody else touches. I have a savings account that went up last quarter and the quarter before that. I have a spare key and exactly one person has it. I have a photo on my phone of myself eating a custard tart in Portugal, not looking at the camera, just watching the water. That's enough. That is more than enough.